The whisper was barely audible. Private Hartley cupping his hand to Private Vance's ear, words softer than breath. Blind leading the blind, we're screwed. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Sterling didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He simply continued facing the tactical display he couldn't see, his dark glasses reflecting nothing, and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire briefing room. Private Hartley, Private Vance, since you believe we're screwed with blind leadership, you'll have ample time to reconsider during your extra duty tonight. Report to the motor pool at 2100 hours. You'll be inventorying every piece of equipment by hand in complete darkness until you understand what blindness actually means. The room went silent. 40 recruits stopped breathing. Sterling's head tilted slightly as if listening to their fear. Anyone else have observations they'd like to share? I promise you I will hear them. If you believe true vision has nothing to do with sight, comment honor below. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Sterling arrived at Officer Candidate School with a white cane in one hand and 2 decades of service ribbons on his chest. The candidates watched him navigate the unfamiliar hallway with careful taps, his movements deliberate but confident. His eyes, hidden behind dark wraparound glasses, were functional only in the medical sense. They detected light and shadow, nothing more. A traumatic brain injury 20 years ago had severed the connection between his eyes and his brain's visual cortex, plunging him into permanent darkness at the age of 26. He'd been a rising star then, a captain with a Special Forces tab and a career trajectory pointing toward general stars. The explosion in Mogadishu had rewritten that story, but it hadn't ended it. Sterling had spent 2 decades refusing to let blindness define his limitations, and now he stood before a new generation of future officers who saw only the disability, not the warrior who transcended it. The first week confirmed the candidates' worst assumptions. Sterling conducted classroom instruction from behind a desk equipped with a refreshable braille display and text-to-speech software, his lectures delivered from memory rather than notes. He couldn't see their faces, couldn't read their body language, couldn't catch the rolled eyes and skeptical glances that followed his every word. Or so they believed. What the candidates didn't understand was that 20 years of blindness had transformed Sterling's remaining senses into instruments of extraordinary precision. He heard the subtle shift of fabric when someone slouched in their chair. He detected the almost imperceptible sound of eyes meeting across the room, that tiny movement of heads turning toward each other. He could identify individual candidates by their breathing patterns, their footfalls, the particular way each person's uniform rustled when they moved. His world was darkness, but it was far from empty. It was filled with information the sighted had never learned to perceive. The testing began in week 2, though the candidates didn't recognize it as such. Sterling would pause mid-lecture, his head turning toward a specific corner of the room. "Candidate Okonkwo, am I boring you? I heard you yawn, a large one. You didn't cover your mouth." Okonkwo straightened, stunned. The yawn had been almost silent, hidden behind her hand. Or so she'd thought. The next day, Sterling stopped a briefing to address Candidate Morrison. "If you're going to pass notes, Morrison, at least don't let the paper crinkle. Candidate Reeves, return whatever Morrison just handed you. You can both explain your correspondence during tonight's extra duty." The note had been passed beneath the desk, the paper handled with what Morrison believed was complete stealth. Sterling had heard the faint whisper of fingers on paper from 15 feet away. The candidates began to realize that their commanding officer's blindness hadn't diminished his awareness. It had weaponized it. The incident that shattered their assumptions entirely came during week 3. Sterling was conducting a tactical planning session, his braille display translating terrain maps into patterns his fingers could read. A cluster of candidates in the back row, Hartley, Vance, and 3 others, had been whispering throughout, emboldened by Sterling's apparent focus on his equipment. Their comments had started mild but grown bolder, questioning his competence, wondering aloud how a blind man could teach combat tactics, speculating that he was a diversity placement rather than a qualified instructor. Sterling let it continue for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Then he stopped mid-sentence, turned toward the back row with precision that suggested he could see exactly where they sat, and began to speak. He recited their entire whispered conversation verbatim. Every word, every skeptical question, every cruel joke. His recall was perfect, his delivery flat and unhurried. When he finished, the silence was absolute. "I gave you 4 minutes to exhaust your creativity," Sterling said. "I heard every syllable. I know exactly who said what. And now you know something about me. My blindness is not your advantage. It is mine." The story of how Sterling lost his sight and what came after began circulating that same week. Sergeant Major Wallace, Sterling's aide, had served with him since before the injury and saw no reason to keep the history secret. Mogadishu, 2005. An ambush during a humanitarian escort mission. Sterling's vehicle hit an IED, and the secondary explosion sent shrapnel into his school. He'd lost consciousness with his team pinned down and enemy fighters closing in. He'd woken in the field hospital, completely blind, and his first words had been about his soldiers. All 7 survived because Sterling, in the seconds before losing consciousness, had called in their exact coordinates for air support, describing positions he'd memorized before the blast took his sight. The military had offered him a medical discharge with full honors. He'd refused. He spent 3 years retraining, learning Braille, mastering adaptive technology, developing his hearing until he could navigate by echolocation like a human sonar system. He'd argued his way back to active duty, then fought through every prejudice and bureaucratic barrier to reach his current rank. He hadn't just adapted to blindness, he'd made it irrelevant. The candidate's behavior transformed almost overnight. They stopped whispering entirely, not because they feared punishment, but because they'd begun to understand what Sterling represented. Here was a man who had lost the sense most soldiers considered essential, and instead of accepting limitation, he'd rebuilt himself around the loss. They watched him more carefully now, noticing things they'd missed before. The way he tilted his head when listening, triangulating sounds with geometric precision. The way he walked through unfamiliar spaces, his cane tapping a rhythm that painted the room in his mind. The way he remembered every voice, every name, every detail from conversations weeks old. His memory had become a palace of sound, and he navigated it with the same confident, sighted people navigated the visual world. The candidates began to see his blindness not as disability, but as transformation, a crucible that had burned away dependence on easy perception and forged something stronger in its place. Sterling's teaching methods evolved as the candidate's respect grew. He began sharing techniques he developed over 20 years of operating in darkness. Lessons about attention, about presence, about the information that hides in sounds most people ignore. He taught them to close their eyes and identify each other by footstep. He conducted night exercises where all lights were forbidden, forcing candidates to navigate by sound and touch alone. He explained that true situational awareness wasn't about seeing everything. It was about perceiving what mattered, processing information faster than the enemy could act on it. "You rely on your eyes too much," he told them. "Your eyes can be fooled, blinded, distracted. Your ears never close. Your skin feels vibrations you don't consciously notice. Learn to trust what your eyes can't show you, and you'll see more than you ever did before." The candidates absorbed these lessons like recruits who'd finally found the training they didn't know they needed. Graduation arrived on a clear December morning. The candidates of OCS Class 24-7 stood in formation, their transformation complete. When Lieutenant Colonel Sterling walked to the podium, his cane folded now, his path memorized, his steps certain. They watched with something that had evolved far beyond respect into reverence. He faced them without seeing them, but they understood now that he perceived them more, completely, than any sighted instructor ever had. "When I arrived," he said, "you saw a liability, a blind man pretending to be a soldier. Some of you whispered about it. I heard every word, and I'm grateful for them. Your doubts gave me the chance to show you something important." He paused, his head turning slightly as if taking in each face through sound alone. "The battlefield will take things from you, your certainty, your plans, perhaps your sight, your hearing, your limbs. Leadership is not about what you possess. It is about what you do when everything has been taken and you must still move forward. I have been moving forward in darkness for 20 years. Now you know the path. Walk it without fear." The ceremony concluded with a presentation the candidates had planned in secret. No easy feat with a commanding officer who heard everything. Candidate Okonkwo, selected as class speaker, approached Sterling with a wooden box. Inside was a brass compass, its surface engraved with braille. The inscription read, "To the commander who taught us to navigate without sight." Okonkwo placed it in Sterling's hands and watched his fingers move across the raised dots, reading the words. Sterling's jaw tightened. His throat worked. When he spoke, his voice carried a roughness that hadn't been there before. "I've received many honors in my career. Silver Star, Legion of Merit. None of them—" He stopped, steadied himself. "None of them told me that my blindness had become a gift rather than a wound. This does. Thank you." He raised the compass, and though he couldn't see the candidate's salute, he heard the sharp synchronization of 40 arms rising as one. He returned the gesture, precise and proud. Years later, those candidates would scatter across the military, commanders, strategists, leaders who taught their own soldiers to perceive beyond the obvious. They would tell their subordinates about the blind colonel who heard whispers and transformed mockery into lesson. And in their offices, on their desks, many kept compasses they never used for navigation, just reminders that true direction comes from within, and true vision requires no sight at all.